latest news, and you may have heard of it, but there was a juror, number 52, who participated in the trial of Officer Derek Chauvin, and he's been making the rounds on the media. And he's spoken with the Wall Street Journal. He has spoken with Good Morning America and also some other radio shows and podcasts. And he essentially is giving his account of how the jury decided to convict Officer Chauvin on all 3 counts in the connection with the murder of George Floyd. And as you already know, ever since that verdict was announced, there's been huge debate about it, right? Team Chauvin is pissed. They wanted him to get off. And the people who thought he should be punished, most of them got what they wanted, although some felt that some of the charges were unfair, like the 2nd-degree murder and the 3rd-degree murder. And, there can be arguments made about that. But the vast majority of people in general, Republican or Democrat, felt that Chauvin should have gotten some punishment at least. But the big narrative that is being floated, and really this narrative was floating even before the verdict, even before the trial, the Team Chauvin crowd was arguing that if he is convicted, it will be because he didn't get a fair trial, because the jury would have been motivated by this threat of riots. They would have voted to convict because they were afraid that if they voted to acquit, there would be riots and chaos and civil unrest. Now, I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened, because I think it would have. However, as of today, there is no evidence that the jury was influenced by outside factors. Now, there was another juror who was actually an alternate, but sat through the entire trial, didn't even know she was an alternate. And she came to the conclusion that Chauvin was guilty as well on all 3 counts. But when she was filling out her application or her questionnaire or whatever they give you when you're doing jury duty, as she mentioned to one of the interviewers that she was feeling a little bit of trepidation about being part of the jury because if she decided that her opinion was that he was innocent or not guilty, then that could result in riots. However, she did not say that her decision was based on that. That was twisted by a lot of conservative commentators, or they left things out. They left out the part where she was only talking about choosing to be on the jury. Or actually, in her case, it wasn't really a choice, I don't think. But still, when the question was raised as to whether or not she wanted to be on the jury. But now a new one has come out. His name is Brandon Mitchell. He's a 31-year-old high school basketball coach. And like I said, he was juror number 52. And he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And according to the Journal, they said, quote, "The jury got the case on a Monday evening after a full day of closing arguments. Once they had selected a foreman, they took an initial vote with 11 of the 12 jurors ready to convict Mr. Chauvin of manslaughter. The lone holdout told the group that the juror needed more time," Mr. Mitchell said. So the jurors had a chance to explain why they felt the charge fit. So what he's explaining here is that 11 of these jurors were ready to convict at least on manslaughter. And then there was one who wanted to chew on it a little bit more and discuss the issue before they came to a conclusion. Makes sense. Nothing wrong with that. But the authors of the article said by the time it was the holdout's chance to speak, the juror had already come around. So by the time it was the hesitant jurors' turn to give their opinion, they basically came around after the conversation. Now, it proceeded in the same way with the other charges. So on 3rd degree and then on 2nd degree, this same juror was still hesitant. But by the time they had their discussion about it, they engaged in conversation, and then they came around to believing that he was guilty of the other 2 charges as well. It took them about 3.5 hours to reach a consensus on 3rd degree murder. And by the time they got to 2nd degree, it only took about 20 to 30 minutes. So I'm guessing in that 3.5 hour conversation, there was already enough for all the jurors to agree that he was guilty of those charges. Now, Mitchell told the Wall Street Journal that each member of the jury had their own opinions on exactly when Chauvin violated the law. So some may have thought that he violated the law once he put the knee on the neck, or some maybe thought he was violating the law after 5 minutes or whatever. I'm just making this up, but they don't all agree as to exactly when he violated he violated the law, but they also agreed in the end that he had violated the law. Mitchell said they all agreed at some point that it was too much. Like what Officer Chauvin was doing was too much. And what's also interesting is that this Mitchell guy says he also felt a level of sympathy for Derek Chauvin, which if I were him, I wouldn't have said that out loud, but I get it. I get it. I mean, he says he's a human too. And Mitchell said that when he saw the verdict being read and saw Chauvin's reaction, he said, quote, I almost broke down from that. Quote, we decided his life. That's tough. That's tough to deal with. Even though it's the right decision, it's still tough. And I can totally understand that. That is not a position I would ever want to be in. So the question came up inevitably as to whether or not Mitchell believed that that outside forces influenced the decision that the jury made. They asked if he thought that the threat of riots or statements made by politicians or other factors brought about that verdict. Now, here's what he says. Let me go back here. He said, and by the way, this was, okay, yeah. So with the Wall Street Journal, he said that he did see news reports about the protests last year, but he did not believe other jurors were influenced by the unrest. He says, quote, the human aspect of it in terms of watching somebody die every day, it outweighs that tenfold. So watching the footage over and over again and seeing the testimony, that outweighed anything that outside influences could be saying. Also, when he also made an appearance on Good Morning America, and he repeated that contention. He says, quote, those things are so secondary throughout the trial because throughout the trial, you're watching somebody die on a daily basis. So that stress alone is enough to take your mind away from whatever is going on outside the four walls of the courtroom. That wasn't even something that was in any of our minds. And that's what he said to Robin Roberts. He also talked about why he came to the conclusion that he did and why the rest of the jury did as well. He said that before the trial, he hadn't watched the entire bystander video of the incident before the trial. So he had watched clips of it and he had watched, a certain level of content on it, but he hadn't watched the whole thing, which I think a lot of people didn't. But he said that was the most powerful evidence in the trial. But he also cited the testimony of Dr. Martin Tobin. He was the pulmonologist who testified as to how the actions of Chauvin and the other officers on the scene restricted Floyd's airflow, thereby causing his death. So here's another quote from Brandon Mitchell, quote, he was the most excellent expert witness they could have had. He just solidified everything because he spoke so scientifically, but elementary. That's actually a compliment that I heard he got a lot. I remember during the trial, people were saying he broke things down in a way that was so easy to understand. And on the other hand, Mitchell just didn't think that Eric Nelson, who was Chauvin's defense attorney, was very persuasive. And other people have said that too. Lisa Christensen, the alternate juror, also said that he may have overpromised because he promised to give them a whole bigger picture of the context of what happened, and he didn't really deliver on that. Like, for instance, one of the witnesses, Dr. David Fowler, Mitchell says that he didn't find him to be very convincing. He said, when Fowler was coming to the stand, I thought he might be able to possibly prove something else, but he didn't really tell me anything that I thought was concrete. And he brings up the theory that George Floyd died because of carbon monoxide poisoning because his face was too close to the car, to the exhaust pipe. And Mitchell says his contention that carbon monoxide poisoning may have killed Mr. Floyd didn't fly with the jury. He says, I don't think anybody paid that any mind, which makes sense. I mean, I get what Eric Nelson was trying to do. He was trying to get reasonable doubt in there. But I mean, that wasn't the best way to go. But again, he had to throw whatever he could at the situation. Now, I'm going to go back to what Lisa Christensen said. And because they asked if she had been on the jury and not an alternate, if it ended up that she was in that room trying to decide, what did she believe? How would she have voted? And she said, quote, I would have voted guilty. However, at the end, the judge did read us the rules for deliberation, but it was quick and I could not absorb it. I would have said guilty on some level. After I was excused, I did not look at the jury instructions any longer. I do not know how hard the process was, but I feel like Chauvin is responsible for Mr. Floyd's death. So she probably would have voted for at least some level of guilt, maybe all three, maybe just manslaughter, maybe 2 out of 3, whatever. Now, again, people on the right, especially the authoritarian crowd. And by the way, I'm not saying that anybody who disagrees with the verdict is an authoritarian, but the authoritarian crowd on the right has been speculating that Chauvin went down because of the threat of civil unrest. And like I said, I did this in a previous video. I made this prediction that they were going to do this. And they were already priming us for that narrative before we even got close to the verdict. But there are a couple points of contention coming from the right. And I think this has a level of validity about some of the things that Brandon Mitchell said. For instance, when he did an interview on a radio show, I believe, he said he was asked what message he would give to people about saying yes to jury duty. And he said, quote, I mean, it's important if we want to see some change. We want to see some things going different. We got to get out there, get out into these avenues, get into these rooms and try to spark some change. And then he added, quote, jury duty is one of those things. Jury duty, voting, all the things we got to do. Now, I kind of get what he's saying here, but that probably was not the best way to present that, right? I mean, it kind of sounds like it can give the impression, especially for people who want to take it this way, that he joined the jury to become an activist. I don't think that's going to get Derek Chauvin off on appeal, though. I think it's a bad look, but I don't think they're going to have to come with something more than that. But there's still more to this. Now, remember, I'm not like a lot of my fellow conservative commentators. I'm not afraid to give facts that could go against what I feel. And you already know, I always believe that Chauvin was guilty and that he should serve time for what he did. And that was based on the video, that was based on the medical examiner's report, which said a lot of things that conservatives left out to promote a narrative. But there's another aspect of this that I want you to see, and let me go ahead and pull it up here. All right. So it appears that, and I don't know if the defense missed this or if the defense just didn't think this was that big of an issue, but this is on RT, but I mean, it's been reported by other outlets. It looks like Brandon Mitchell had attended, first he attended the March on Washington that was linked to, to be kind of an homage to Martin Luther King's March on Washington. And that wasn't really about police brutality. That was about a lot of subjects, and police brutality just happened to be one of them. So a lot of people are using that to say, oh, well, if he went to this march, that means that he wasn't going to be fair to Chauvin. No evidence of that. But here's one thing that might work. Where to go? In one picture, he is shown wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. Wait, let me switch it over. It's pulling up the tweet, and I don't want it to do that. 1 second, bear with me. Let me just switch it over to Twitter. All right. Okay. Now, I'm not paying attention to the text of this tweet because obviously this Team Chauvin here, but I'm going to just pay attention to the pictures. Now, he's appeared with a Black Lives Matter shirt on, but not just a Black Lives Matter shirt, one that says, get your knee off our necks. Now, Black Lives Matter alone doesn't mean that he was biased. I mean, people can say Black Lives Matter. I say Black Lives Matter, but I will defend a cop when he deserves it. But the fact that it's specifically for George Floyd, that's not looking too good. This might be grounds for an appeal. Again, this doesn't mean that Chauvin's going to get off, because they still have a lot to prove. They still have to prove that he was not swayed by the prosecution. Also, the question is going to come up, why, if this were an issue, why didn't Eric Nelson, Chauvin's defense attorney, get him disqualified as a juror? Because they go through your social media. Like they vet you fully before letting you on a jury. It could have been an oversight, or maybe Eric Nelson didn't think that this was enough to where he believed that Brandon Mitchell wouldn't have an objective point of view here. But that'll be something interesting that comes up. Now, I still in the end, I still don't believe that Officer Chauvin is going to get off. I think at the very most, they might be able to overturn that second-degree murder. But even then, he's still going to serve a lot of time in prison. I mean, he's facing up to 40 years. I don't think he'll get that. I think he'll get something closer to 20 years. But I think that's the best that they've got. I mean, Team Chauvin is hoping that he'll get fully acquitted for whatever reason. And honestly, I think they're going to be disappointed.